I'm very pleased to be joined by Juliette Touma, Director of Communication at the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Juliette, welcome to our program and thank you for finding time for us.
Thanks for having me.
I would like to start by asking more personal questions. Over the past few years, you've been to Gaza many times and you've been there also last week. What kind of visit it was for you?
Well, it was certainly my first visit since the war started, and I was, first of all, relieved to see colleagues of ours and to reunite with our colleagues on the ground. But it was also very visible the level of destruction that this war has left on the infrastructure in Gaza. I was there in the south, in Khan Yunis and in Rafah. And during the time, this is before the pause has started, it was constant bombardment during the day and during the night. We were at a meeting with our staff when the whole building shook due to a bombardment next door. And then during the night, I was myself awoken by the sound of bombardment. And one could not stop and think about the families who have been enduring this brutal war for 50 days and what it means for parents, for children, for older people, for professionals, for UN workers. It has been devastating and unprecedented.
You've also mentioned your colleagues. In the last few weeks, you've lost over 100 of your colleagues.
Yes, sadly, 111 colleagues of mine who work at UNRWA, they have been killed during the war. The vast majority of them were teachers. One of them was a gynecologist. Her name was Sirine. In fact, Sirine was one of the very, very few gynecologists in Gaza. She is sadly killed. There were people who worked with us in engineering, support staff, in a staff safety, so a whole number of colleagues. And these are not numbers or statistics, these are colleagues of ours who were killed totally unnecessarily during this war. We will always remember them, and we will never be the same without these colleagues at UNRWA.
Your teams are entering Gaza with aid during the last days of truce. What do they report?
So our teams are on the ground, and they are on the receiving end, and they don't enter with the aid. They are in Gaza. UNRWA continued to be in Gaza during the war. We are there committed to stay and deliver for the people of Gaza. We have been there for more than 70 years. We are the largest United Nations agency working on the ground in Gaza, and we are committed to continue to deliver assistance and to be there with and for the Palestinian communities in the Gaza Strip. What we are doing right now is our teams are going to the border with Egypt to transport the supplies and the trucks that are coming in, and then on to distribute them, especially to shelters where UNRWA has been hosting more than 1 million people in more than 150 facilities.
Mm-hmm. And what have you been able to accomplish during these last days, and what the needs are still there?
Look, the pause has been very welcome, first and foremost, by the people in Gaza, including our own colleagues, because the pause had brought some respite, some calm to the people of Gaza after 50 days of a very brutal war, heavy bombardment, displacement, uncertainty, fear, loss, and grief. We have seen an increase in the assistance that has come in. Fuel has come in, cooking gas has come in. And what we're hopeful for is for this pause to continue, but more importantly, for this pause to transform and translate into a longer-term humanitarian ceasefire for the sake of civilians wherever they are.
And you have been running schools and medical facilities in Gaza. They served as places of refuge for civilians in the last few weeks, but they were not safe there either. How can you describe this situation?
So yes, you're right. Before the war, UNRWA used to provide education to 300,000 boys and girls in UNRWA schools. UNRWA, by the way, is the UN agency, the only UN agency in the world that runs fully fledged school systems. We have our own UNRWA schools. And then since the war began, we sadly had to close these schools and to use them as shelters. So we have now 156 shelters. The vast majority of them are schools used to shelter families. These shelters are overcrowded, and yes, they have not been spared during the war. UNRWA has recorded more than 100 incidents where our facilities, including shelters where there were displaced families in them, they were hit during the war, and we sadly lost nearly 200 people who were taking shelter in these facilities.
And since October the 7th, nearly 80% of population in Gaza have been displaced. World Health Organization warned that the risks of epidemics are increasing each day due to the lack of clean water and sanitation. The weather is also changing. How it challenges your work?
Yes, in one of the shelters that I have visited in Khan Yunis, there were more than 30,000 people crammed in one place. People were forced to sleep on the concrete floor in the shelter. It used to be a training center where UNRWA used to provide training to young people in Gaza. Now, no longer. We use it as a shelter. People were literally on top of each other. Families continued to come in. Some families arrived early on. Those who arrived early on told us that they didn't have a change of clothes. They were wearing the same clothes for the past, what it was, nearly 50 days back then. They lacked clean water. They lacked food. They lacked warm clothes. Many of them were still wearing their sandals, although it had just rained a few hours before we arrived at the shelter. The sewage was overflowing. Our shelters are overcrowded, and we have really taken over our capacity in these shelters. This is why it's absolutely critical that we have more shelters and that we also have more assistance coming in. The flow of supplies needs to be steady and regular so that people have the very minimum that they need. They need food, they need clean water, they need blankets, they need warm clothes, they need the very basics for a dignified life.
And if the military operation will continue, what is your stand?
Look, we really hope that this pause continues, and we hope that it becomes a humanitarian ceasefire. A resumption in the violence is going to be devastating for the communities in Gaza. And we have been overwhelmed ourselves responding to the needs on the ground. The needs on the ground are just huge. They will not go away very, very quickly. The destruction across the Gaza Strip is huge. People lost their homes, their property, their work. The markets are completely closed. When we were driving around in Gaza, every shop was closed, the pharmacies were closed, the banks were closed, apart from a few vegetable stalls here and there and some bakeries that stayed open. There is nothing. So there needs to be a boost to the private sector so that commercial supplies come into Gaza as well.
Juliette, thank you so much for this first-hand information and for talking to us. Juliette Touma, Director of Communication at the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.